Hello, and welcome to Basics of Immigration, Port of Entry. Today we are going to talk about the port of entry or ports of entry into the United States, what they are and what happens there in very basic terms. If you remember, back at the very beginning, we had the United States, this territory, and to come into the United States, a non-citizen alien needed to come through a port of entry, abbreviated as POE. Let's start by defining the word port. What is a port? You probably already know this one. A port is a place that has been designed for things to come into it. If you Google what is a port, it will tell you about technological ports and computers and computer networks where people can connect in. Some people have medical ports. I've seen people where they have a port into their body where multiple different medicines can be put into their body in that one place. And of course, there is the traditional original word port was used for a seaport where all the ships come in and people and goods come to that port. That's what a port is. Now, for purposes of immigration, we're going to talk about three kinds of ports, or three places where there are ports. They're all the same kind of port. The port is for people to enter the country, and everybody who comes into the United States should come through a port. So we'll talk about three ports. One port would be a land port. On the borders of the United States, there are designated places where people are supposed to come into the country, ports of entry. There are also seaports, just like the traditional port, where people and goods come on a ship. The ship comes, and then you get out and you go through the port of entry. And finally, today, in our world today, we have an airport where we fly into the country. This port, I put it here on purpose, may be far from any of the borders of the United States because you're flying in. It's still a port of entry, even if it's in the middle of the country, nowhere close to a border. It's a place where people are allowed to come in. An airport. That's why that word is there. At each of these ports of entry, basically the same thing happens. Inspected or examined by a government official to determine if they get to come into the country. So we're going to break that down. Who comes into a port? What happens? Well, the first group that comes in are U.S. citizens. You may not know that, but even citizens are supposed to come in through a port. So we'll put over here our USCs. If you've ever flown into an airport, you've probably seen these different categories outlined because they have signs that say, if you're a US citizen, go in this line, and if you're others, go in these other lines. If you're driving up to a port of entry, it's much more car by car. They determine who you are and how to handle you. But again, in an airport where hundreds of people come at one time, they go ahead and divide you out before they talk to you. So if you say you're a US citizen, then you're going to go and they're going to check to make sure that you are actually a US citizen. You need to have some proof of that. The gold standard for that is a United States passport. And most of the time, that's what you have to have. There are a few places where you're able to have a birth certificate, but that's an exception today in the current time. Mostly you need to have a US passport to show that you're a US citizen. So that's pretty straightforward. If you have that passport, welcome, you're done. Easy peasy. I have had a few times at ports of entry on the land borders where I've been asked where I'm going, what I'm going to do, those kinds of questions. So they may ask a few additional questions, but generally you come on in, you're a US citizen. The second category of people are LPRs, lawful permanent residents, that we've talked about before. These are people who have permission to live here permanently. When we first talked about LPRs, you may remember that I mentioned that there are a few things you can do where you actually don't get to stay in the country. And that's one of the things that the government official will check for. So first they will check to see, do you have proof that you are an LPR? Do you have the documentation showing that you're a lawful permanent resident? And then if you do, they will check to make sure you haven't done one of these things that make it so even though you're an LPR, you don't get to come in. And we talked about a few of those, maybe committing certain crimes, maybe leaving the country for too long. Lawful permanent residents are supposed to stay in the United States. Otherwise, they abandon their residency. So if they've been out of the country for too long, they may run into some difficulties here. But in general, once people show that they have proof that they're an LPR, welcome on in. One other group I'll mention here is people who are coming in to become an LPR. That very first time, they've already been to the consulate in another country and they got an immigrant visa that gives them permission to come to the United States permanently. Now they come with their immigrant visa to the port of entry and they show it to the government official. And if the government official feels like everything is in order, then they admit them as a lawful permanent resident. And it's at that point that they become an LPR here at these ports of entry. And then that brings us to our third category, which is our non-immigrants. Remember them? The non-immigrant is someone who's coming into the United States for a temporary time for a specific purpose to accomplish. They also went to the consulate and they got a visa, but their visa was a non-immigrant visa. And now they come to the port of entry to see if they get to come in. Once again, the first thing the government official will check for is to make sure that they have a visa. And if they don't have a visa, then they will usually get sent home. If they have the visa, then comes a little fun thing here, a little wrinkle. At the consulate, they got a visa. But at the port of entry, the government official tells them how long they get to stay with that visa in the United States. So it's a separate process. We have a visa and we have how long they get to stay. So, for example, most of the time when people go to get a tourist visa, that visa is good for 10 years. For 10 years, they can come and go to the United States without having to go back to the consulate every time. The consulate has looked at their case and said, you have enough connection to your home country. We're pretty sure you're not going to move to the United States. You can go back and forth visiting. But they don't get to come and stay for 10 years in the United States. When they get to the port of entry, the officer says, great, you have this 10-year visa, and we'll give you permission to stay here for 6 months this time. If the non-immigrant comes and they stay for 6 months or less, and then they leave, fantastic, then they can come back later during that 10 years. And they can come again, and CBP will say, you can stay for 6 months again, or 3 months, or whatever period of time they want to give them that they can stay here. And they can use that throughout the time they have their visa. But they are two different things, how long their visa is for and how long their length of stay is, that they have permission to stay. Some visas, the officer is going to say you can stay for the whole time. Let's say that you have a student visa and your student visa is good for 4 years. Most likely CBP, the government official, is going to say you can stay for 4 years. You can stay while you finish this program that it's been determined you're coming to do the program. You can stay for that full time. No problema. Of course, that would be the length of time would fill in the whole visa. So it just depends on what kind of visa they have, what they're coming for, all those types of things. As we've talked about in the non-immigrant section, there are so many different reasons people come with a non-immigrant visa. So what happens there will vary a little bit. But the important thing to know is there are actually two different processes. A couple of other things I'll talk about briefly here and more in another segment. Let's say that people don't have any proof of any of this. One option is they get sent home. You have nothing to come into the country, you go home. Another option is they could be paroled in, which means they're given permission to enter for a time. And that's in another segment. You can learn more about parole. They could also show up at the port of entry and they could claim asylum. And at that point, legally, we would start to consider their claim of asylum and they would be able to be in the country while the government is determining if they truly meet the definition that allows them to have asylum. That's probably the main categories. There are a few other things we might talk about, but in general, that's what would happen at a port of entry. So let's just put that up here really quickly. If they have no documents, they're not a US citizen, they're not an LPR, they're not a non-immigrant, they're not an immigrant with an immigrant visa, no documents, they could seek parole, asylum, go home. Those are the big ones that I'm going to explain. All right, so that's the port of entry. Everyone's supposed to come into the United States through a port of entry. At that point, the government official determines if you're coming as a US citizen, as an LPR, as an immigrant to become an LPR, as a non-immigrant, or in some other category. If you have any questions about port of entries, please feel free to leave a comment and I'll see if I can answer it. All right, talk to you later.